There are many adaptation management frameworks that step through several processes or phases to help you understand your climate risk and plan what you will do to reduce it. I've summarised them into 4 steps. In this video, we consider the second of those steps, understanding vulnerability and risk assessment. It's helpful to build your understanding of vulnerability and risk assessments through a series of definitions. Vulnerability assessments emphasise exposure, sensitivity and adaptive capacity of systems, assets and populations, while risk assessments tend to focus primarily on projected changes in climate, impacted assets, the likelihood of the impact happening and the resulting consequences. Both are useful. Understanding vulnerability helps better dig into what aspects of an asset or system will be most impacted by a changing climate and how tackling the impacts in different ways may build resilience and reduce impacts. Knowing something about consequence and likelihood help to prioritise which risks to address. Hazard is another word commonly used and sometimes confused with risk. Hazard is any potential occurrence of a natural or human-induced physical event that can cause damage to property, infrastructure, livelihoods, service provision, environmental resources, and so on. This tends to be climate variables. Think things like extreme temperature, increases in sea level, rainfall, fire weather, and so on. Vulnerability is the propensity or predisposition to be adversely affected by climate change. It can be thought of as being made up of sensitivity and susceptibility to harm, and a lack of capacity to cope and adapt. Sensitivity is the degree to which a system is affected, either directly or indirectly, by or responsive to a hazard. The analogy I like to use is that my English genetics mean I burn easily in the sun. Adaptive capacity is the ability to adjust to potential damage, to take advantage of opportunities or to respond to consequences. Thinking about my analogy, I can put on sunscreen, wear a hat and avoid going out in the midday sun to avoid sunburn. This is analogous to adaptive capacity. Let's use the example of vulnerability of healthcare services to heat waves to think about this. The sensitivity of healthcare services is high to heat waves. They report increased ambulance call-outs, presentations to emergency departments and admissions to wards, and these are highly likely to increase, particularly in the summer months when staff may be on leave. But most healthcare services have heatwave response strategies that can increase their adaptive capacity. But nonetheless, we'd still say that their vulnerability of healthcare services is considered high for all of Australia. If we add exposure, we'll see different vulnerability ratings for different parts of the country. The scale of analysis is important to uncover differences in vulnerability. There will also be differences in the sensitivity and adaptive capacity of different health centres and locations. Okay, now let's look at risk assessment. Risk is defined as the potential for consequences where something of value is at stake and where the outcome is uncertain. It is often represented as the likelihood multiplied by the consequences. Assessing risk is familiar to most organisations. Tables of risk rating use consequence and likelihood to rate risk. So for example, if the consequence of a severe storm is major and the occurrence of that type of storm is likely, then the risk rating would be classified as extreme. Where the consequences are minor and the event is unlikely, then the risk rating is low and decision makers may choose not to address it. Risk ratings can be determined without considering a specific situation or locality. In this example, risk ratings for the electricity sector have been created. Risk ratings can be determined without considering a specific situation or locality. In this example, risk ratings for the electricity sector have been created simply by looking at likelihood and consequences. So, for example, extreme winds can damage overhead networks, and the consequence of this is major due to loss of power and time to rectify. Extreme wind speeds are likely, and so the risk rating is high. In most cases, integrating vulnerability and risk assessments will give a detailed understanding of how to address possible climate change impacts. Risks can take account of how sensitivity, adaptive capacity or exposure is driving the possible consequences of a potential hazard and the likelihood of being exposed to a particular hazard. This approach will lead you to better understand your risks and better identify ways to address them. A hazard can have different consequence for different parts of your system, organisation or asset. It is likely that you'll have to consider these different categories of consequences using evaluation criteria. For example, consequences to business continuity might range from no or minimal interruption through to rendering operations virtually dysfunctional. And the consequences can vary between different criteria. Bringing this all together, we can see how an integrated risk assessment might be undertaken. We begin with understanding something about sensitivity. Consider past experience or what is currently known about a system or asset. For example, the operating specifications for plant equipment. Similarly, past experience, behaviour, existing management plans, or thinking about the system or asset now can build a picture of adaptive capacity, and then together these give an understanding of vulnerability. It's worth noting at this stage that you might identify a residual risk. That is, even if the climate was to remain the same, you still have untreated risk that could be addressed even if the change in hazard is uncertain. At this point, you can turn your attention to the future, using climate change projection scenarios to test what-if scenarios and consider the consequences of these different scenarios. Climate science will give you information about likelihood, and this will give you your risk rating. Climate change risk assessments can be completed at different levels. You may need to iterate through the assessment at different levels, refining your analysis each time, depending on the objective of your planning process. Here's an example of a 3-tier approach from Coast Adapt. A first pass risk screening is a straightforward, low-cost screening of exposure to climate change risk based on readily available data or expert opinion. It might help decide if a more detailed assessment is required. It can also help get social and organisational buy-in to act on adaptation and to help frame your adaptation approach. A second pass risk assessment takes a standard risk-based approach similar to standards like ISO 31000. It generates a risk register, and that can be used to identify adaptation options and opportunities. A third pass or detailed risk assessment allows further investigation of prioritised and shortlisted risks. It's likely that you'll require more detailed expert knowledge to undertake this step.